Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full PreFrontal, where executive function and self-efficacy, learning, and issues that help us become self-aware is what we tackle. I'm your host, Sucheta Kamath. My hope today is that through these meaningful and thought-provoking conversations, we can truly find a way to guide ourselves and take charge of our life. And just to those who are new to this podcast, a gentle nudge. If you haven't already done so, please be sure to follow us on our social media and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. So help us spread the love. And now let's start with our conversation today about personal, interpersonal, and intrapersonal resilience. Each of us need to acquire skills to successfully build strong families and effective teams to lead a meaningful life. And who better than our guest today? So welcome. Our guest today is Dr. Taryn Marie. Oh my God, I didn't pronounce your name correctly. Stejskal? Stejskal. Let me do that part again. And that's why I'm excited to have our guest today. Her name is Dr. Taryn Marie Stejskal. Welcome to Full PreFrontal. How are you?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the warm welcome. I'm very well. How are you?
Fabulous. And it's so interesting. You are going to be my first bridge conversationalist who is going to help us connect not just resilience in learners, but younger generation, but adults, and even those with leadership positions. So I'm very excited to talk to you. So this podcast is about executive function, which entails strengthening your adaptive capacities to self-regulate and self-guide, particularly so that we can effectively communicate, take good decisions, collaborate, and create those environments around us during challenges and roadblocks. So before I get into your expertise, I would like to know a little bit about your own executive function and your own self-regulation. As a child, what age did you become aware of it? And when did you come to realize that there's some changes you can make to your own approach to life?
Yeah, that's I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. So that's
great.
That's super fun. Well, you know that I have a background in marriage and family therapy and in neuropsychology. And so I'll use some of those psychological terms, but for anything that's not commonly used, I'll make sure I also define it, for our audience as well. But I think for me as a child, I remember always having a high level of what we would call in psychology, like self-monitoring, right?
Yeah.
So when we think about like self-regulation, this idea of like, how do we keep ourselves regulated, right? Emotionally, mentally, and sort of stay in balance, and what's our relative awareness about our own regulation. And then this idea for me that's coming up as you're asking me this question, like self-monitoring, right, is this idea of monitoring ourselves internally and projecting ourselves mentally into the shoes or into the experience of the other person and thinking about, I'm acting one way, how is that coming across, right, to the other person, this idea of self-monitoring. So I would say I'm still very high on self-monitoring. And of course, there's costs and benefits to that, as there are with anything. But as a child, I remember very early on thinking about, even at 4 or 5, like preschool, kindergarten, thinking about how is this person experiencing me and what do I need to do differently in order to affect the outcomes that I want to have or to make them like me or something of that nature. And, I think that's also consequent to the environment that I grew up in. I grew up with parents who are very loving and, I think really desired to do the right thing for my brother and I. And when my brother was born, when I was 3.5, it was like he had maybe more needs or more concerns that my parents felt like they had to attend to. And so, you know, my mom would say like, oh, I need to feed your brother, you know, like breastfeed him when he was a baby. Can you go over here and just like play by yourself or something like that? And so I think that started with this idea of self-monitoring, where I would think about, you know, am I playing quietly enough? Am I being disruptive? Am I being helpful to my mom? How is she experiencing this? So that's, you know.
Well, she's very lucky because, of course, sounds like to me quite advanced growth and awareness on your part as a child. And she must have tremendously benefited to have such a mature child to take care of while she's taking care of a baby. So I really appreciate that. I think it's so interesting. Your story just quickly reminded about my own, that I too had incredible social awareness and social understanding, and the way I was raised to have that at the forefront of my relationship with people. And that aspect of self-regulation where you have to somehow put your needs a little bit on the back burner so that there's a collective collaboration between you and the others was a top priority as a culture and as a family. And that really created, there are some disadvantages to that, as you know. But it does create a great sense of willingness to work with people, and particularly difficult people. So that brings me to this great question, and I'm so excited to talk to you about, and particularly the way you frame and your own journey to come into this through the work that you have done with people with a traumatic brain injury, which is where I share your interest. You say that what you have a wonderful way of describing. Let's start with what resilience is not, which is it's not merely bouncing back. And I hate that way of using an elastic rubber band and saying, you know, bouncing back, returning to former shape. It's a very, very superficial way to understand. So would you help define for our audience what is resilience? And another thing I was thinking about as you talk about this, does resilience look different in different stages or age group? So that can we bring these principles of resilience as we talk to this adaptive adjustment that adults have to do versus children have to learn?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, did you see that Rubbermaid commercial? I'm trying to remember when this was, Sucheta. Do you remember the Rubbermaid commercials, like a Rubbermaid
Collapsible?
trash can?
Yes.
Do you remember? The car would drive in, it would like dent the trash can, and then the car would, you know, reverse, and the trash, you know, the Rubbermaid trash, it would like spring
return
back
to form. Yes, I remember.
Or I can't remember when those were on, but I want to say like the 90s, right?
Yes,
So,
I do. I have seen that.
Okay, good. We're both dating ourselves, but that's all right. We saw reruns.
Yes, it's all reruns.
So, you know, I think for a long time you know, there's so many words that we use in the English language and phrases, and they're very representative of how we think about the world. But when we really think about those phrases and start to pull them apart, we say like, like maybe that's actually not what's happening. You know, maybe I'm just using this, call it as a cognitive shortcut, right, to describe what's happening. And so often I think we use this cognitive shortcut, right, which is this just kind of way of grabbing a phrase that we've heard without really thinking about it, you know, intentionally or deeply. And I think that's what's happened with the phrase bounce back, right?
Yes.
And bouncing back works great if you're a Rubbermaid container. And when we think about resilience, you know, one of my questions that I wanted to understand is not only what is resilience, but what is resilience not, right? And so if I just start with what is resilience, I have a very simple definition. Because when I first looked up resilience, the definition was really circular. You know, it was like, to be resilient is to demonstrate resilience, right? And resilience is to be resilient. I was like, this doesn't make sense. And so for me, as I've interviewed hundreds of people and collected thousands of pieces of data, what's come to the fore in terms of a definition for resilience is this idea that we engage, right? We effectively engage in challenge, in change, in complexity that comes our way. And we allow ourselves to grow through that process to be enhanced rather than diminished, through those experiences. So
And I
that's,
really like what you're saying there is there's an active, it's a verb, it's an action. It's
yeah,
not something that done to you. Like
indeed.
the Rubbermaid containers sounded like it didn't do anything. There was no volition on the part of the container to come to form. And second thing is, I think important thing you're distinguishing, which speaks to my heart, is this, that an adverse or any interaction with the world that provokes challenge leaves its mark. And we should be really acknowledge that. We shouldn't be mark free, because then we are trying to say, I am exactly the way I was and nothing has affected me. That's not at all resilience, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think your comment has really kind of teed up this second part in a really perfect way, which is this, this idea that, well, first of all, kind of going back to how we think about language, I intentionally use the word challenge, right? And the reason that I do that, so my research is based on asking a really simple but really powerful question, which is, and we can do this, you and I, Sucheta, and we can also have our audience do this, right? Like in this moment. So for those of you that are listening. And so the question is, think of a time where you have faced a significant challenge, right? In that moment of significant challenge. And by the way, challenge is intentional, because a challenge can be good or a challenge can be adverse. And typically, spoiler alert, it's never just one or the other, right?
Yes.
It's a little bit of both, right?
Yes.
A new baby is a challenge, right? Challenge. A medical diagnosis is a challenge, and there's parts of that are incredibly adverse, and there are parts of that turn out to be incredibly positive as well. So anyways, we're thinking about a time where we've effectively faced a challenge, a significant challenge, right? So we think about the significant challenge. How did we effectively address that challenge? And then what I wanted to understand from people was, what behaviors did they employ, right? So our nervous system, when we're in a moment of challenge or change or complexity, right? We have this neurological, we have a physiological response, and our nervous system says your three options are to fight, are to, fly or kind of run away, right? Or to freeze, right? Those are typically the three options that our brain gives us. And I wanted to say, what are the other options, right? Because those three options, they might promote resilience, right? But in this day and age, there's opportunity, I think, for us to think about what are the other behaviors that we can use to effectively address those moments of challenge, whether that's someone losing a job or figuring out how to work their current job and, kind of homeschool their children in the midst of a pandemic. Or, when we receive challenging information, a difficult health diagnosis, new information. And so I asked this question of hundreds of people, and I collected thousands of pieces of data. And from that, it gave us the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, which I'll talk about. But first, it also helped me define what resilience is, and also what resilience isn't. And so what came out of that was the three myths of resilience, right? Accompanied by the 3 truths. And so the 3 myths are just what we're talking about, which is, the first myth is we bounce back, right? That's the myth. So the truth is we bounce forward.
I love that. Yes.
Right? And because, to your point earlier, I love how you said this, we are fundamentally and forever changed by every experience we have. And that's supported also from a neurological basis, right? Every experience we have, right? This moment of doing this interview, for those of you that are tuning in as listeners, we are literally changing your lives. You're welcome, right? but as a result, hopefully in a great way, right? But as a result, some part of our brain, some neural connections that exist are firing and rewiring in different ways as a result of having the experience of listening to this podcast, right? So we're fundamentally and forever changed by every experience we have, let alone, the challenges, the changes, and the complexity, right? And so this idea of going back to a prior state doesn't exist.
Yeah. And
right?
it doesn't even make sense, because what are we going to do by going back to be ignorant, going back to not having a baby? I mean, it's literally a fantasy at that point. It is moving forward and for better. Yeah, it completely makes sense to me.
Often, I think one of the things that's come up in the midst of the pandemic, and I think it's important to speak to this, is this idea, so many people are saying, and I'm sure you've heard this, Sucheta, and for many of you listening, so many people are saying, when are we going to get back to normal, right? Like so many people, right, want to go back, right? And there are absolutely things about my old life that I miss too, right? Like I miss, the movie theater, and I miss, being able to travel without restriction and go on vacation. And, there's things that we miss about our prior life. But the idea is, from a resilience standpoint, it's like, let's not go rushing back to normal, right? Until we know what we're going back for, right? So to your point, how do we create this new future, this new existence, right? That's better than what we had before? Because by the way, I think we would also acknowledge there were a lot of things that weren't working, before the pandemic, right? There were a lot of things that were not working. So, but when we think about dispelling this myth of not bouncing back, of not going back to the way we were before, there's also an opportunity for us to then mark, right, what we've lost, to grieve what we've lost, to acknowledge what we've lost, and I think that's a really important part of the process. On the one hand, with the sort of bouncing forward versus back, like so many people have come to me and they've said, Taryn, I'm not resilient because I didn't go back to the way I was before the challenge, right? And so then I can dispel that myth, and people feel better about themselves because they expect that they're not meant to be changed by challenge. We know we're changed. But when we talk about then bouncing forward, then the opportunity is to grieve, to mark, to acknowledge, to appreciate that as we do bounce forward in those moments of challenge, change, and complexity, there's also things that we leave behind.
And Taryn, I really appreciate your compassion in the way you have thought about it, because I think there's a clinical and sterile way of understanding concepts of changes in the brain, changes in human behavior. But we have to ultimately think about what happens to people when they are in the midst of it. What happens to them when people are prodded and prompted to think about it and reflect on it. And one thing that stands out about this pandemic, for example, to your point, going back will be, first of all, you have to come to terms with somewhere that this is not going to happen. But secondly, if you think about the struggles and universality of it, cannot be more evident than any other thing people have experienced before. Mm-hmm. So let's say if you're a group of 10 friends and one person lost a job, 9 people could not relate to losing a job because their job was not lost. But now you and I can talk about our children having to go to school virtually, hybrid, or in person with a mask on. There is such a strong universality, and I feel that can really help us bridge that, bridge towards that healing or acceptance through compassion, and recognize that you are not alone suffering. So let's not make it about you, but also don't panic because you're not alone. There's so many people suffering the same way. And that can also give a lot of sense of courage, I think.
I agree. One of the things that people tell me when I speak to, organizations or to teams on leadership, one of the exercises that we do, and this is adapted from an exercise that I don't know if you're familiar with Rachel Hollis, but she wrote, Girl, Stop Apologizing, and Girl, Wash Your Face. She's great. And so this is an exercise that I was inspired by her work to create in my work. And so it's an exercise where she does it at her conference, where for me, when I'm working with my clients, I write down like 10 or 12 questions professionally, right? So, and they're just yes or no questions, right? Things like, have you missed important events, right? Because you've had, because you've needed to focus on work, right? Or do you take work home with you in the evenings? Do you work on the weekends, right? Have you had a change in manager, right? And then also personal questions, right? Like, have you become a caregiver this year? Have you or someone that you know struggled with addiction, right? Have you lost a family member or a friend that was close to you in the last year, right? Like these kinds of questions, right? And so what happens is we collect all the papers, right, from everybody. We say, don't put your name on it. We collect all the papers, and then we smoosh. You know, this is a technical, I don't know if you guys are familiar, it's a technical neuropsychological leadership. To smoosh, right, means like to, you know,
Crush it.
Yeah, that's right. So we smoosh the papers together, we mix them all up, you know, so nobody knows where their paper is and, you know, whose paper they have, and we pass them back out. And then they unfold it, and then I read the questions, and then, you know, you're standing up for your colleague, or you're standing up,
I love
right,
that.
for someone on your team. So you don't know who you're standing up for, but you can see in the room the visual representation, right? And there's not one of those questions that just one person stands up for, right? And one person doesn't just stand up one time, you know? And so the key takeaway is, one, we're all more alike than we are different, to your point. Like, yes, there's unique things about all of us, and in the midst of this pandemic, and even before, you know, whether we realized it or not, there's more universalities amongst us and amongst our experience and what we're facing if we go to that level. And two, we're not alone. We're not alone. You know, it's so easy as human beings to think like no one else is facing this, no one else has ever faced this. You know, by the way, in psychology, we call this the Adolescent Fable, right? You know, when we're at, you know, when we take ourselves to a level of maturation, you know, where we're very adolescent, you know, oh, like no one else has ever had to deal with homeschool, right? No, everyone's dealing with homeschool. And so the opportunity is for us to remember in this moment, and to your point earlier, it's more evident than it ever has been before, not just within the United States, but like across the globe, that we have this universal shared experience and connection as humans.
This reminds me of an exercise I do with children, or when I do my workshops with teachers, and it's foxes and rabbits. So the idea is that and these are not more complicated questions that you posed, but asking children, giving children two choices that, let's say, has anybody taken your pencil, or, you know, have you kind of misplaced your homework? So your answer is yes or no, but then you foxes is if that has happened to you, and rabbits if it hasn't. So when you take these questions and ask the students in the class to raise your fox or rabbit, now you begin to see, oh, whoa, well, apparently I was thinking I was the only one, and you begin to recognize that awareness that it is to have these experiences to be human, and then only then you can take the step forward. So tell us a little bit about now your 5-step principle. And I love the title of your book, and I love this idea of flourish or fold, the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. And please start. Tell us all the 5 stages and steps, and enrich us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you everything. I'm going to tell you everything I know. Yeah. Before I tell you everything I know about the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, I'm just going to take us back for one moment to the myths and truths of resilience, because for those of you that are really paying attention, you know I said there were 3 myths and truths, and you know I only talked about one. So I don't want to be shysty and, you know, try to get something past you.
Please, I'm so sorry I missed that. You did not get to the 2. Yes. Share with us. Thank you for keeping me on track.
Yeah. So the first myth is that we bounce back, and the truth of resilience is that we bounce forward, right? The second myth is that resilience is fixed or finite, right? That we're only given a certain amount of resilience, or it's a dichotomy, right? Like I'm either resilient or I'm not resilient, right? And so that's the myth, that it's fixed or finite. And the truth of resilience is that it is dynamic and can be grown and changed and enhanced over time, just like we might increase our cardiovascular capacity or our muscle tone by going to the gym, right? So by way of facing challenge, change, and complexity, that's the best way to train our resilience. We don't have to face adverse circumstances in order to become more resilient, but that's sort of like the, the accelerator, for resilience. And then the third myth is that a lot of times we think or speak about resilience as though it's passive, right?
Yes.
And so if you think about, just think about how people often say, again, without questioning it, the cognitive shortcut of, Sucheta, time heals all wounds, right? How we say that. And so what that suggests is that all we need to do is to sit back and to wait for time to pass and everything's going to get better and feel better. And certainly time does soften things. There's truth in that. And I think it's more akin to what Andy Warhol said, which is time changes things, but you have to change them yourself. And so the myth of resilience is that it's passive, and the truth of resilience is that it's active.
I love that. And thank you for adding that clarity, because just as I wish in schools we have a class on executive function and class that talks about resilience as a process. So, process is to learn. It requires intentionality. And also, once you learn how to learn, you can learn anything. But learning how to learn can be individualized, it can be personalized. And that's exactly what I have been doing in my work. And the parallel I see in the way you're framing this idea that it also goes with the other framework that we are very familiar with, is that fixed and growth mindset. So if your approach to adversity is that, shoot, now I'm fired from my job, that's it. Well, people get fired, people get hired, but your goal is to maintain that you have a job. Then getting fired and getting hired is part of that process. So I feel often, and speak to that if you can, that there is some sense of big picture that one needs to activate, the sense of gestalt. And those who see the bigger picture tend to demonstrate greater resilience. Is that what you have seen in your work?
Yeah, there's a model for anyone who's read Option B by Adam Grant and Sheryl Sandberg. There's another well-known model of resilience that exists that they speak to in their book. And they talk about the extent to which people think, how people think about what happens to them, right? And so it's this idea of, let's see if I can remember all the P's, personal, right? Pervasive and permanent, right? And so those are the three P's, just in case you're not clear. Those are not the resilient. That's not the resilient side of the model, right? Yes. And so, when we make it personal, we say like, oh, there's a fault in me. There's something wrong with me. Bad things keep happening to me. Well, it's just because I'm, whatever, right? The negative things that we say to ourselves. So that's how we make it personal. These are the things not to do. Pervasive, right? Which means we're globalizing it, right? Like, to use your example of a job, right? Like, I've lost my job, and no one else is going to want to hire me. This is pervasive, right? Like, the entire job market
is now saying no to me.
Yes, is against me, right? And then the last one is permanent, right? So to the extent to which we say, and I will never get another job again. I will never have another opportunity again, right? And the point is, when we go through challenge, change, and complexity, especially in those like acute moments, right? Those moments like right when the event is happening, it's easy to jump into a personal attribution, a pervasive attribution, a permanent attribution, right? And that happens. But the point is not if it happens, right? But the point is to not stay there, right? To not allow yourself to stay there in terms of call it your cognition, the way that you think, that your mindset. It's okay if it happens at the beginning, and then, the opportunity, the resilient opportunity is to choose more resilient mindsets and behaviors to then be able to move forward.
So now that you have helped us understand the myths about resilience and those who do fold because of these attitudes, and I had David Burns on my podcast a couple of episodes ago, and he talks about cognitive distortions and the 10 cognitive distortions, which is why we may be misleading ourselves. So, talk to us about your 5 principles, and how do you think our audience can understand this, and how can we, because one thing I love the way you have structured your research and understanding is everything you say is so very easy to understand why that makes sense, or rather it makes so much sense to me, and second, it's so easy to adapt. It's so easy to live by the principles you talk about. So that's why I'm very excited. So walk us through that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll give a shout out. You know, I had a mentor relatively early on at the at Virginia Commonwealth Medical University when I was just starting my fellowship in neuropsychology. And you know, I came in like the first couple of days, and I was meeting with people that had brain injuries and their family members. And after those meetings, he pulled me aside and he was like, "Look, these people have had brain injuries. I don't know if you noticed." And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, you know, and their family members, like some of them have a high degree of educational attainment, but many people, you know, have a 4th grade reading level, right? Or maybe didn't graduate from high school, right? It's all kind of walks of life, you know, when you're working in a clinical or a hospital setting. And so he said, look, you've got to figure out how to explain whatever's happening as though you're explaining it, you know, to like an 8-year-old. Right. And not in a condescending way, not in a pedantic way, you know, but you can't use words like pedantic.
Yes.
And so, you know, I really credit that experience where I went home and I said, like, okay, how do I break this down? How do I explain it? And, you know, I think we tend to make things more complicated sometimes than they really are. Yeah. I tend to use big words and like not even realize it. And so that's an opportunity for me to keep growing, to, you know, to choose words that engage the broadest audience of
I suffer from that.
Learners possible, right? But it was learning, you know, it's like, how do we take what we know and then explain it, you know, to an 8-year-old? And I still believe that if we can't explain something in simple terms that anyone can understand, we probably don't understand it well enough yet.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. So the first one is
vulnerability.
Yes.
Yeah.
Brene Brown probably has now made that a common space word, which, as you know, you and I know, being in this field or in this space, that is one of the simplest and most important rite of passage to come to terms with what you're dealing with. But I don't think recently I was in a meeting and talking to this white male in his 50s. I used the word with him, please be vulnerable. And he understood me. I couldn't have imagined that before. No, yeah. Not meaning to stereotype. So tell us how vulnerability plays such a critical role.
Yeah, well, you know, what I would say is, even if we understand the concept of vulnerability, and I would say that I don't think the concept of vulnerability is like widely understood. But even if we understand the concept of vulnerability, I think it's very difficult for most humans to be vulnerable in practice, right? And so, you know, just what happened for those of you that are listening, tracking along, right? I just wanted to understand resilience. I wanted to understand the key behaviors that would make us more resilient in these moments of challenge, change, and complexity. So I asked this question, right? Think of a time when you faced a significant challenge. How did you effectively address that challenge? And then after interviewing hundreds of people and collecting thousands of pieces of data around those elements, when I looked at that qualitatively and coded the data, what emerged were these organizing concepts, or the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, the 5 things we can do. And so the first one, you know, is vulnerability, as we've discussed, but what does that mean in this context, right? And it means that we allow our inside self, right, like our sort of internal self, to match our external self, right? So we allow our thoughts and our feelings and our experience, what's happening for us on the inside, to match, right, the version of ourself that we're showing to the world, right? Now, there are certain times when maybe it's not effective or advantageous to do this, right? But for the most part, being able to be in environments where, you know, what I say is we just run one operating system, right? We're not thinking and feeling and experiencing one thing, right? And then, you know, going to another. And so, you know, that's what vulnerability is. But, you know, according to Brene Brown, and given that that came out of my research, the idea is like, well, why are we not all living these like fabulously vulnerable lives, right? If we know vulnerability is important. And so what came up there was this idea of the shame bias, right? Which is the belief that, you know, Sucheta, if you tell, you know, your resilient story, if you share about something that you faced in your life, right? Typically we'll think more of you, right? Because we'll think, wow, Sucheta, she's so accomplished. She's got this podcast, all the things. And wow, look at the story. Look at what she's overcome, you know, look at what she's faced. But then for me, when I think about engaging my own vulnerability, or for many of us, right, the shame bias comes up, right, which is this kind of cognitive process that I coined, which is the fear around showing people who we really are, you know, because we often imagine that if people know or knew who we truly are, you know, the three L's would happen, right? They won't like us, people won't like us, they won't love us, and they might leave, right? And so, and that's the shame bias. And so, you know, I'm I'll call it a thriver, right? After post-traumatic stress disorder. I would like to rename that post-traumatic stress response, but that's a whole nother podcast. You know, after having a stalker in high school and developing 2 decades of, you know, symptoms of PTSD at the diagnosable level. And, you know, I didn't want to tell people about that. You know, I thought that that would threaten my credibility as an executive if people knew I had a mental health diagnosis that I was, you know, actively grappling with, right? Or had symptoms at the diagnosable level. And so I hid that for a long time. And the shame bias is what told me to hide that. You know, Taryn, if people knew that, they wouldn't like you, they wouldn't love you, and you'll probably get fired, or they're going to leave. Somebody's going to leave, right? And so as part of this work, I started telling people the truth about myself and about this experience. And I don't think there's anyone who didn't like me because of it. I don't think there's anyone who didn't love me because of it. There's probably a couple people who left, but, you know, they might have needed to leave anyway, right? We get to, you know, realign the people in our lives. And that's the power of vulnerability, right? And facing the inherent sort of fear or cognitive bias that we're going to be shamed or left or not loved or not liked or not accepted for who we are. And so it's the foundation of resilience. It's tremendously powerful. And when we think about leadership, you know, we talk a lot about empathetic leadership. We talk about authentic leadership, and authenticity and authenticity and empathy, right? They grow in the soil of vulnerability.
I love that. And I think, again, to me, if you don't talk about your vulnerability, you are also kind of signaling that life has been easy for you. And to me, I'm never trusting those people for whom life has been easy, because the hardest work that life has made you do is the reason why you are willing to do more hard work. And I'm talking about the inside work, the work that makes us want to grow from inside out, not achieve and dominate and control. So people who receive this training of becoming humble, to me, they tend to do better anyway. So I love the way you're explaining to us. So how about the second component, that productive perseverance? Again, you have very cool ways of describing this, I have to tell you. It's just such a powerful and simple way to grab people's attention to important matters. So how do you explain that?
Thank you so much for that. Vulnerability is often something that I talk about more just because, really defining what that is and then the shame bias associated with it. The other ones are a little simpler, or at least the description's a little shorter. So productive perseverance is the second practice of particularly resilient people. And this is the intelligent pursuit of a goal. And this idea that it's as much of an art as it is a science at times. It's knowing when we maintain the mission, despite challenge, despite facing adversity. And when, in the face of recognizing there's diminishing returns, we pivot in a new direction. And so a question that I often get about resilience is how are resilience and grit, right? Angela Duckworth's work, how are those alike and different? And I think grit is, the staying the course part of productive perseverance, right? The continuing, right, on our life's mission, no matter what, come hell or high water, right? And grit works really well when the landscape doesn't change, right? When everything stays the same. So I want to be a Navy SEAL. Well, there's a certain series of objectives to become a Navy SEAL. It's going to be hard, but I'm going to be gritty about it. And I'm going to become a Navy SEAL or graduate from the Naval Academy, right? Angela Duckworth collected some of her data from the Naval Academy. But, right, being gritty doesn't always work when the environment or the market is changing substantially as it is right now, right? And so we have this opportunity relative to the second practice of particularly resilient people, productive perseverance, to take a step back and say, are these still the right objectives? Are these still the right goals? Is this still the right strategy? Is this still the right plan? If yes, all right. And if no, then let's pivot in a new direction, right? So the sort of the converse, right, of being gritty and staying the course is not turning the ship soon enough, right? And there's great examples of that too, right? Like Kodak, Blockbuster, they were super gritty, but they didn't realize, right, that the landscape had changed. And I think something else that's important just to recognize here around productive perseverance and the intelligent pursuit of a goal, something that's really meaningful for people is oftentimes, especially as we get older, we're afraid that we missed our chance. We're afraid that it's too late to do something that we've always dreamed about doing. And, what I loved when I turned 40, I saw this, meme on Instagram or something like that. And it said, when they were 40, right, Julia Child was still working in advertising.
Yes, I love that.
Have you seen this? And, the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? He didn't found Kentucky Fried Chicken until he was in his, 60s,
I think, yes.
Yeah. And, Stan Lee, right? The author of Marvel Comics and things like that, right? He just published his first comic when he was 40, And Malcolm Gladwell has a great article about this that I always go back to that was in the New Yorker a long time ago. And basically it's this idea that we equate precocity, right? That was a new word when I read Malcolm Gladwell's article, precocity, to be precocious, right? To be driven. Yes. We equate precocity, to be ambitious and driven with youthfulness, right? And with genius, right? If you figure it, if you're Doogie Howser, again, dating myself, right? Physician, right? Who gets through medical school at 16, that then, we think of that as we equate that with genius, right? Yes. But often, what we find is that we come into our zone of genius, or we come into a new zone of genius later on in our life, right? And so one of the takeaways from productive perseverance is this idea to not allow ourselves to believe that solely based on age that we've missed our chance.
Several thoughts come to my mind, but I'll share one idea that Malcolm Gladwell talks about this cultivated curiosity. He says, I always do my work by going to the New York Public Library. And when I am looking at a book, he said, I don't like this going to the internet because there's something called next to the book that I'm looking at, there are 2 books to the right and 2 books on the left that he always likes to look at and see what are those books about. And so that exactly speaking to that, in order to that productive perseverance, that identifying the goal, and people who are really good at that recognition of that situational intelligence to shift the goal based on the context, and a newly defined norm for yourself. What if you have changed and your goal is no longer the one goal that you are pursuing? And so kind of having that openness to it is a great sign of resilience. I love that. I'm going to pause for a second. It's 2:54. Do you have time to finish the remaining three in next 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think we can finish the last 3.
So, Evie, I'm going to begin here. So how about the next 3? Walk us through, I'm being very mindful of your time. So walk us through what the next 3 ideas are.
Yeah, we'll do the next 3 at like sort of lightning pace, but I know that all of you are going to be able to follow along. So the third practice of particularly resilient people is the practice of connection, right? And when we think about connection, a lot of times people go right to like external connection. And it's important for us to realize that connection is really twofold. And the first part is the connection with ourselves, right? So learning to listen to ourselves, learning to trust ourselves, learning to listen to that still small voice within, learning to not abandon ourselves is incredibly important, that connection with ourselves. And, right, you know, that's one fold, internal. The second fold is the connection that we have externally, right, with our neighbors, our friends, our family, our colleagues, and being able to draw strength and support and positivity from those connections. Yeah.
Another thing about connections, to me, it's time and again, every part of research has talked about that the importance of connection. And to me, we are humans and we cannot survive without that social connectivity, and connections propel us to become better people, but also achieve more. So that can be a source of energy to adjust ourselves and so that we can forge forward, I guess. So that's great. How about the next one?
I'll just say quickly, you know, I think it's about not simply whether we have connection or not, but it's also about the quality of the connection that we have, right? And so there's this idea, this is not my own, that we become the average of the 5 people that we spend the most time with. And so it's about the quality of people that we also surround ourselves with, because if you know, I like to say, like, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. You're going to become the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with.
Yes, I love that. And so the next one, you say gradiosity. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, gradiosity. So this was a word that I made up.
I love it.
Apparently you can do that when you conduct qualitative research. And it was meant to really encompass this idea of what I was hearing from people. One, about gratitude, that they would look on the challenge that they had experienced, and even if, you know, the challenge was thought of as adverse, right, like some kind of health diagnosis or a job loss, that they would be able to look on that challenge over time, right, like not in the moment, but over time, and to say, you know what, I can see the good in that. I can feel gratitude for having had that experience and how I was shaped by that. And then the second part is this idea of generosity, right? So then we share our resilient stories, we share our lessons generously with others so that they have the opportunity to learn vicariously through our experience.
And I think I love that word because it kind of, in a way, grand generosity, you know, it's like has that grandiose, over the top indulgence in being generous. And in my work, I talk about the concept of generosity of spirit. So generosity, I think people also have a very limited sense of how it applies to, and often people think that we are being generous with our time or treasure or talent. But I feel, how about becoming generous with our spirit, which is accommodating all variations in human folly, and with great respect and love, becoming a better tolerant community, I guess. How about the last one? How about the possibility? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if you kind of think of these practices on a continuum, right? Like vulnerability, I'm learning, is really about, that's a foundational element to resilience. It's foundational to connection. It's foundational to the generous aspect of like sharing those stories. We have to be vulnerable on some level. And then possibility, you know, if you kind of think about it on a continuum, is really one of the highest order practices of being resilient. And it's being able to navigate this polarity that exists when we face challenge. And so the Chinese character for crisis is the character for, you know, it's the compilation or combination of the crisis for danger and the character for opportunity. And so possibility is about being able to navigate the inherent polarity that exists in any challenge, where there's an element of danger and there's an element of possibility. And how do we both acknowledge the danger and also harness and engage with the opportunity or the possibility that exists in any moment?
Well, Taryn, I'm so happy that you found time for us to be on this podcast. Those who are listening, please know Dr. Stejskal's work is available to you, not just in a form of a book, but she's taking a new direction, which is she's offering a course. I highly encourage to follow her on her social media. We will be linking information about her work and possibility of taking this course in our website in the show notes. So please follow up with that. And once again, this is Sucheta Kamath. Thank you for being with us on this podcast, Full Prefrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function. Thank you so much, Taryn, for being with us.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.